You know when someone publishes a perfectly timed video and it almost feels like it was made just for you and the exact situation you find yourself in? Unfortunately, that's probably not going to be this video for you, but that did happen to me recently when I watched this video from Adam C. Eunice. I wasn't even looking for solutions to anything, I was just casually watching for fun when...
So this is the game in 640 by 360, and we're going to scale it up to 3x, so that now we're looking at it in, 1080p, right? Now this looks good, as long as the camera is not moving. They're clipping over that, integer number of pixels.
My game totally does that, and it has caused me issues in many different areas. I knew scaling up art might be a solution, but I hadn't looked into it yet, and then...
On the flip side, if I just take this and pop it up into, 1080p, go back to full screen, now we've got this beautifully smooth camera.
This is the part where I got excited because I didn't realize it would be that easy to solve. It's a bit different in Phaser, but all I had to do was change the zoom, which would control the native resolution of the game from 4 back down to 1. And instead apply a zoom to the camera at runtime, which would scale up all of the art. But the actual internal resolution and how all the pixel positions are calculated would be happening at the smaller resolution, resulting in much smoother results. I also had to turn off the settings I was using to make sure Phaser rounded coordinates to the nearest integer, which was specifically for dealing with the old pixel perfect approach I was using. And in general, I just went through the codebase and removed anywhere where I was forcing things to be round integer values. As Adam points out in the video, this isn't pixel perfect now in the pure sense. For example, now I can walk up to something, and if we look really close, we can see that the pixels are not precisely lined up on a pixel-sized grid. But that isn't a concern for me at all. And it provides so much more flexibility and everything is just smoother in general. Like now I can use this nice smooth camera lerp, which I had to turn off previously because it caused a lot of jank. I can now more precisely control the player's speed, so when the player walks on the sand, I can ever so slightly decrease their speed. I have a whole video about the troubles I was having with this previously with the pixel perfect approach. Another issue I had was that if you pick up an item and walk around with it, it would be all jittery because it is constantly updating as the camera moves around in full pixel increments. But again, with the new approach, it is smooth as, and actually makes for a pretty cool way to carry around some combustible item as a light or heat source at night. And there have been other benefits too, but that wasn't the end of the wisdom Adam had in store for me that day.
Drawn in such a way that their pixels are bigger than these. This looks bad. This is called mixels, right?
Yep, I'm doing that too. Not that I was just drawing art at random sizes, but I was programmatically scaling things for variations in the plants without having to draw them at multiple different sizes. And then for the ocean, I created the waves using a shader that would render a pixelated effect, but that wasn't at the same size as the rest of the game art. So I fixed that up as well, which I think looks much better, but it also means I'm going to have to put some more effort into creating more art for variations now. All of this happened in a bit of a whirlwind after watching that video late at night, and I probably made all of these changes to the game in a few hours. These changes are probably the most noticeable since the last devlog, but I mentioned last time that now that I have the general feel of the environment to a decent point, I was going to be switching over to focusing on the actual survival gameplay mechanics. But before I could do that, I needed a solid foundation for how the player actually interacts with the world. Which means I've been focusing on a lot of little micro interactions to get the feel right, which doesn't look impressive in a YouTube video. It takes a lot of time, but it does improve the feel of the game a great deal. I had some basic stuff in place already, like the player could move any movable items around by clicking on them and then clicking somewhere else. And you could interact with things by hitting the E key, which would launch a little selection wheel, and you could use the arrow keys to make a selection. Basically, I hated the way all of it felt. It was just awkward and unintuitive. I made quite a lot of changes, so I'm just going to quickly zoom through some of what I've done. Perhaps the most awkward thing was that previously the active item was determined by whatever item was closest to you, and that would be the one you could interact with. Which meant you kind of had to do this awkward wiggling around to get the item you want selected. Now, quite simply, it's just based on whatever the mouse is hovering over. But you can only select items that are within a certain radius of the player. If you pick up an item within that range and try to move it outside of that range, the player will just drop the item. There were some awkward interactions I needed to take into account here so that everything worked smoothly. For example, I added some checks to make sure that you can't place an item directly over the top of another item. You can see if an item can't be placed, it gets a red tint. I have also now made it possible to just right click on an item to interact with it, and you can also select an item with the mouse as well now instead of the keyboard. If you prefer though, you can still perform this entire interaction with the keyboard as well. If you interact with an item, it will give you the interaction options for that item, but you can also interact generally with the environment, and what options you have will eventually change based on what item in your inventory you have active. And that's another system I polished up. This inventory bar has been in the game for a while now, but it hasn't been usable. This won't be a typical inventory system. This will display your current loadout of gear, and you'll be able to change which one is active. And you can do that now either by using the numbers on the keyboard, or you can also just click on a slot. Of course, there are no items here at the moment. That's what I'll be working on next. I'll likely be adding an axe that you can use to harvest water from paperbark trees, and a spear that you'll be able to use for spear fishing as you walk along the shore. Big thanks and shout out to Adam C. Eunice, of course, for the valuable tips. Not just for these ones, but I've got a ton of good advice from Adam's channel over the years, and I'll have a link to that in the description. And of course, if you've enjoyed following along with the progress of my game, a like or subscribe before you go would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you back here for the next one.